Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. Very much looking forward to the conversation today. And Khari, thank you so much for moderating and helping to organize everything.
Yeah, of course. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So just to give a quick overview in terms of today, I'll begin just with some opening thoughts around this topic of navigating your career and finding your professional compass. Then after that, there'll be a moderated Q&A led by Khari and myself. And then we want to leave as much time as possible. It's a small group, so we want to leave as much time as possible for open Q&A and any questions that people have. And then, as always with these sessions, I'll end just with office hours. So if there's something unrelated that you want to speak to about after the hour has passed, I'll remain on the line and happy to answer those questions as well. Just a few quick conversation reminders. Please do actively raise your virtual hand on Zoom just to signal to Khari and I that you have a question. And feel free to turn on your video is always great if you're comfortable, optional of course. And then if you have any questions, you can also type it into the Zoom chat. Khari will be monitoring that as well. So with that, maybe just to dive into the discussions for today. So the four core topics and themes will be how to find your professional compass, choosing a specialty that provides growth, aligning to concise career goals, and planning on long-term career trajectories. I'll touch on some of these in the opening remarks, but then Khari will also help to moderate them and bring it into the Q&A that way. Maybe just to begin, though, for those who I haven't had a chance to meet, just begin with a quick overview in terms of background and career path, which I feel like will be relevant for the conversation that we'll have today. So I'm originally from New York City. I'm a first-generation college student. So in terms of figuring a lot of this stuff out, doing exactly what everybody is doing today in terms of tuning in for conversations like this, reaching out to mentors, people that were 5 to 10 years older than me and picking their brain is a big part of how I was able to think through a lot of this stuff. Had gone to Wharton for undergrad, did a variety of different internships. So first at Google, then Goldman, then Morgan Stanley. I think that one of the themes from this conversation that I'll touch on is in this process of finding your professional compass. I think that touching a variety of different companies, roles, industries, it can be really helpful in terms of narrowing in and honing on what you do enjoy and where you do find excitement and so forth. Started full time after college within Morgan Stanley in investment banking first, then sales and trading, then a strategy role focused on increasing business with Asian, Black, and Hispanic clients, followed by a role in talent management focused on internal mobility and how we move our top performing analysts from one part of the firm to another. At this point, as I was going through my time at Morgan Stanley, I knew that I eventually wanted to go to business school. And so my thought process was, let me try to expose myself to a variety of different things within the industry that might give me a perspective in terms of what I wanted to do longer term and so forth. After being admitted into business school, I decided that I wanted to do something the summer before starting that was different from what I had previously done. I've always been passionate about education. So I was able to find an education role based in China, working for an organization that was building partnerships between Chinese and US universities, and then also teaching a course on public speaking and doing some executive coaching. But I think that one of the luxuries of business school is it affords you the opportunity to really do, a little internship either before starting the program, of course, during the program, and then after the program as well. So it's these narrow pockets of time where you can explore something that is radically different from what you might have done professionally up until that point, which is one of the things that I really enjoy about the experience. And then, of course, went to business school, got my MBA at Harvard. And while I was there, there's really three core things that I was focused on. First being how do I develop leadership skills? The second being how do I study organizational behavior, which is the bulk of where I focused my coursework, and also had the opportunity to work with a professor to create an organizational behavior course called Crafting Your Life, which is all about helping MBA students identify their purpose and then live with greater intentionality. So, of course, some of the themes that I researched as a part of that course will be relevant for the conversation today as well. And then lastly, just gaining personal clarity, which I'll speak about momentarily in terms of what it is that I ultimately want to do. Then after graduating, I moved to Singapore, joined BCG, spanning industries, mainly financial services, TMT, and industrials in terms of what I've worked on. And although based in Singapore, my projects have spanned and also covered Thailand and Indonesia so far. And this past July, I moved into a new role at BCG. We're building out a leadership institute. So I'm the design manager for that program, which basically means building the curriculum that it's like a mini MBA program that a cohort of about 120 senior executive clients go through And my role involves building the content and thinking about the learning experience that these individuals go through. So that's what I've been working on the past handful of months. So to dive into finding your professional competence, I think that on this theme, whenever I think about it, one thing that I found tremendously helpful is to think about the core questions that you would enjoy spending your career actually thinking about. So for me, at an individual level, this is how, do you help people reach their full potential? At an organizational level, it's how do you help companies create a culture where their employees are engaged? And now the reason that this serves as a compass is because whenever I'm evaluating a role, I can basically think about these two core questions and I can ask myself, will this role provide me the opportunity to think about these questions? And if the answer there is yes, then that becomes a way for me. That's an early indication that I might be stepping or moving into a role that could be a good fit. After I've identified that, then I like to think about what are the skills or related topics that I need to become more knowledgeable at or better at in order to be able to effectively address this question. And then once I have those clarities around skills, I think about from an action perspective, what are the tangible topics that I can take? So if I think about, what I can do on the individual side, a big part of the reason why I enjoy doing these Zoom events is it's an opportunity to focus on that question and just even something as simple as learning the skill of moderating and speaking and so forth. You can create ways for you to do that yourself. And then on the organizational side, a lot of what I'm doing at BCG with this Leadership Institute, it gives me the content to be able to focus on that question of engagement within the workplace for organizations. So once you have the professional compass, the thing that I find helpful is in choosing a path. I'll use consulting and investment banking as an example just because that's my own background. But I think that the ratings here, I won't dive into my views on each of these because I think that's not necessarily relevant. But what is relevant is really think about what you're looking for in a particular role. So when I was thinking about, my career path, I think learning and skills, understanding your interests, the quality of life and compensation, these were kind of four areas that were, came to mind as things that were important to me. And then you can really do a side by side comparison to think about, okay, at a high level, what do these roles offer and why? And so again, I won't dive into the specifics of why I feel this way about consulting or investment banking, and it really doesn't matter. But I think what does matter is that you try to put pen to paper in terms of thinking about what are the traits. So if you think about the left-hand column, I think that's really important. What are you actually looking for at this point in your career and with your next move and so forth? There's also to show an alternative view to this, which is a bit more detail. One exercise that I do is something that I like to call a career matrix, where basically I will, when I'm thinking between, and this is actually something that I put together and use. So I anonymized it by just calling it roll 1 through 10. But basically, this past July, before I had transitioned into this role within BCG at the Leadership Institute, I was actually considering a whole bunch of roles. So these are actually 10 actual roles that I was contemplating. A handful of them were internal, a handful of them were external. And I really just wanted to wait out what are the things that are actually the most important to me at this point in my career. And this will change, right? What's the most important to you for the first job out of college is going to be different from what's the most important to you when you're in your 30s, when you're in your 40s, and so forth. So at this stage and at where I am in my life, I felt like this is what was most important to me. The weightings I think are really important. The most important things for me at this point are, who's the direct manager, because that's ultimately who you learn from. And that's really important to me. And then also, do I think that I'm going to perform well in the role? Because I think that at this stage in my career, performance is really key. It's kind of like a pivotal moment where it'll open doors for the next opportunities and so forth. So I won't go into each of these, but basically I create a weighting for each of them. And then I think what's really important is if you look at the individual columns, I force myself to make actual decisions between which one of these two things is going to be better, with the exception of, sometimes where you see role satisfaction being the same, that might be because it's two roles that are in more or less the same industry doing more or less the same thing. So the role satisfaction would be the same. But if they're in a different industry or something, I try to really force myself to think about, okay, which one of these is better, and at least give them like a 0.5 difference. So this is an approach. It's obviously very detailed. It's obviously very numerical. It suits me well. I enjoy it. this approach isn't necessarily for everybody. But one thing I will say about whether it's the more high level approach on the previous slide or this approach that's very helpful is it opens doors. So I oftentimes, when I'm having conversations with mentors, I might give them a copy of this and basically have them press me on things like, I've had mentors say, okay, compensation feels really low. Do you actually not care that much about compensation? And it allows me to engage in a conversation where I'm able to say, actually, no, it's not really that I don't care about compensation. It's just that all of these roles that I'm looking at will lead me down a career path where compensation is going to be more than fine. So I'm not going to really weight my decision on where I go around compensation too heavily. So it allows for some dialogue back and forth with people, which I feel is a lot of the value in the exercise or doing something like this. Khari, I'll love to turn it over to you to lead us through the moderated Q&A.
Yeah, of course. Happy to kick it off, and thanks for sharing those initial touch points. I think, when we were talking before, just prepping for the session, we focused a lot on your time at Morgan Stanley. Yeah, I know you've moved through a lot of different roles throughout that, and obviously that would mean a more robust and kind of in-depth scoring system. But were there any points during that time at Morgan Stanley that you considered shifting away from some of the core like end goals that you would want?
For many people I would speak to, I think that there are some shifts that you'll have as you start to get more experience. You might start to refine what you think that long-term view is. In my particular instance, though, I would say I was pretty confident that I was pretty confident about what I wanted to do in terms of I knew that it was something in the human capital space, organizational behavior space. That really hasn't shifted since college. But I think that what did shift is having a greater understanding of what the roles are. So, as an example, something like spending time as an executive coach is something that I'm interested potentially in doing now. When I started and joined at Morgan Stanley, I didn't even know that there was a whole big industry around executive coaching and that people actually made really good money and were able to do really interesting, impactful work as an executive coach. I wasn't as familiar with that until I actually moved into a role at Morgan Stanley where I realized, okay, every single person that gets promoted to be a managing director more or less has the opportunity to have a coach sponsored by Morgan Stanley come and work with them on an ongoing basis. And when I realized that, it made me see, okay, this is an industry. So I would say that it's okay when those longer term interests move. But to the extent you can lock your eyes in on an anchor that's less likely to move. So in my case, human capital, organizational behavior, those are big umbrellas. By locking my eyes and anchoring on something that's less likely to move, I think that's what really helps serve as a compass and a magnet to kind of pull you in the right direction. But I think for everybody, there will be some change and fluidity that happens as you get more experiences throughout your career.
Gotcha. And then taking a step back in terms of how you made your way to human capital, uh, were there particular, guidelines in terms of like how you wanted to spend your time as a professional that helped inform that kind of like path into that particular field?
For me, I think that one of the very transformative experiences. So when I found out, so when I was in it was in 10th grade. I found out that I was dyslexic. And at that point, I was matched with a learning coach. This coach taught me very simple tactics, like rather than trying to read just directly, I would read and I would listen to the audio from the book at the same time. And it just allowed me to really absorb the information a lot better. And so it took this process of learning, which was really up until that point very painful. And I didn't understand and really have a full comprehension in terms of why it was so difficult when it seemed like, I would compare myself to my brother who, was always a great student. Things kind of came to him a little bit naturally versus it was really difficult for me. And then as soon as I made these slight adjustments after working with the learning coach, it completely changed the way that I thought about learning. And I found it fun to that now, finally I found academics and things like that to be enjoyable and fun. And it just changed my entire outlook on life. And so from that point on, I got really energized and excited about investing in myself. And so I think that that was a big part of the thing that told me I would love to be able to have the same impact on other people. Obviously, what I'm interested in isn't quite, being a learning coach necessarily, but I think the concept is the same. in terms of you can work with people and help them see themselves or help them see other things slightly differently in a way that's going to leave them motivated, inspired, energized, whatever adjective you want to use, but determined to basically focus on bettering their life. And that's kind of the origin of what I wanted to do. And then as I went through as I went through college, as I went through Morgan Stanley, as I went through business school, that started to refine itself from a fundamental, this is how I want to make people feel, and this is the impact that I want to have to people, and turn into, okay, now this is what the actual career path or career trajectory or roles might look like.
And then how did that translate into like actual tasks that you wanted to do, or like actual, the work that you were actually doing in terms of how you wanted to spend your time?
So I think that especially the decisions that I made early on in my career, I think that they weren't necessarily paths that left a tremendous amount of room in terms of designing that actual core path itself. So if I think about Morgan Stanley as an example, I didn't have a tremendous amount of flexibility or control in terms of how I spent my time as an investment banking analyst. But what we all have control over is how we spend our time over the incremental hours where we're not at work. So even when I was at Morgan Stanley, I would do things like I would raise my hand and volunteer to lead recruiting efforts, volunteer to serve as a mentor to the summer interns, things that I got as much things as I could get internal credit for at Morgan Stanley that were connected to what I wanted to do. I would raise my hand and do that because to the extent that you can do it within the context of your organization, it allows you to bring that up in performance meetings. But then there's some things where you're not really going to be able to weave it into your work. As an example, when I was in New York and I was working at Morgan Stanley, I used to host conversations similar to this, but I used to do it in person, and I used to host these events at Morgan Stanley's office, and I would do them weekdays in the evening, or I would do them on the weekends just because I knew that the office space would be free. And so I think that that for me was, this activity that was outside the context of what my work was, but was important for that longer term mission in terms of developing people. And I didn't feel like I was getting enough of that in the work job. So then I had to kind of bring it to the external as well. So the way I like to think about it is if you think about a portfolio or a pie and of what you actually want to accomplish, and you need to get it to 100% somehow. And work might make up, depending on your job, work might make up, 40% of that, 50% of that, 60% of that. But then there's going to be an incremental outside portion that you're going to have to get that fulfillment by creating that opportunity yourself and doing something yourself.
And then at work itself, I think, especially folks coming from like a more academic background, there's a lot of pressure to uh, kind of, especially early on in your career, be a master at everything, a jack of all trades. How practical do you view that as being, kind of like in terms of one, maintaining that, and then two, like in the long term, like plotting out your career, how you should kind of select like specialties and versus like, expanding your view in terms of a long range of verticals?
If everybody takes a moment and thinks about who the most impressive or inspiring person that you look up to is, the reality is that person has one or two, maybe at most three traits where they're actually exceptional. And I think that people make careers and they make livelihoods out of whatever it is that their X factor is, and then they just do that very well. So I think that this jack of all trades notion is probably more applicable when you're a generalist right out of the gate in terms of starting your career. As you progress into your career, I think it is natural that everybody starts to specialize, even people who are management consultants, which is probably the most generalized career track that you can think of. Even people that are going down that path, the individuals, if you look at them at an individual level, they are specializing as they go on. They're either specializing in an industry, and from a skill perspective, every single person is specializing in the skill in terms of sales. Right. So when you start out your career in management consulting, it's all about problem solving. As you get more and more senior, yes, you're doing some problem solving, but it becomes more and more about sales. So I think that like there's that specialization that's going to happen regardless of the field that you go into. That's why I think that the exposure to different roles can be beneficial and companies can be beneficial because it basically gives you a perspective on what are the traits and skills and where might you want to excel, what might you want your X factor to be. So I don't think that you should just, pick something and without kind of test driving it a little bit and kicking the tires to see whether or not that's the right set of skills or traits that you're developing. But yeah, that's how I've thought about that portion.
That makes a lot of sense, especially kind of as you're talking about human capital. Like it's a very broad career, and it sounds like you've picked a very specific kind of like avenue in terms of coaching and mentoring that you want to kind of like dedicate your time into. Um, I think another thing that we did talk about a bit was just if you when you're talking about like allocating your time, I think you have like a percentage that you'd like to dedicate for writing, advising, and coaching, and then speaking. How did you come to kind of like that divvying up of your time? And I guess how does that kind of inform your decision making process as you're moving into new roles and considering other responsibilities that you have to pick up?
Yeah, so when I think about how I'm interested in splitting my time at this point, I think I'd love to spend 50% of my time writing, 30% of my time speaking, 20% of my time coaching. And so I think that the way that I came about that was really a series of conversations. So again, my usual approach is I put pen to paper and and I just make statements one way or another. And so I might say 50% writing, 30% speaking, 20% coaching. And people might say, as an example, when I first started that out, coaching was maybe I think 10%. And when I talked to people, they were like, look, that feels a little bit does that feel a little bit short? Like, might you want to incorporate more coaching into it? And again, the numbers and the percentages don't really matter. What does matter is crystallizing a viewpoint around like how I want to be spending my time. And so my approach for getting to this level of thought is just by coming up with an initial hypothesis and then communicating that to a lot of people. And then when you communicate it to people, communicate it to them in a way where you're not stating it as like this is matter of fact, but you're stating it as like this is my current thinking. How do what are your reactions to it? And really getting input and feedback on it. And the reason it's helpful is as I think about long-term careers, I can start to ask myself what roles allow me to do this, right? Because there's a whole lot of roles that could fit that split in terms of writing, in terms of coaching, in terms of speaking. So really honing in on what are the specific roles that might be able to give me the percentage splits that I'm looking for.
Before we kind of wrap up, I think that the other big question, and I think you touched on this a little bit in your initial presentation, which was around balancing kind of compensation versus influence and kind of some other factors that can be real big drivers in terms of someone's career. Um, how do you optimize for that? And then, how do you think that as professionals you should view like the different trade-offs between, I think, wealth creation versus influence?
It's a really personal decision, of course. I think that everybody should try and actually spend the time thinking about how much money do you actually need and want, and go through that exercise. And when I was going through that exercise, I had actually a lot of mentors, and I would have very candid conversations with mentors where they would explicitly tell me how much they make and do they feel like that's enough, yes or no. And it runs the gamut, right? I had somebody who was a very senior within investment banking told me that you can't have a decent life without making at least 1 million plus a year. Now, I didn't agree with that statement. That's one person's perspective, and I have had plenty of people say, look, I make 200,000 a year and this is what my life looks like, and I can pretty much do everything that I want, and it's great, and my kid, I have everything that I need for my kids. And so I'm able to kind of speak to people along a spectrum and then just get a feel for, okay, how much money do you actually think you'll need? When I went through that exercise, for me, it was really helpful because what I realized is that the amount of money that I need in order to be comfortable, feel like I have enough money to do everything that like I would want to do for my family, everything like that. When I thought about that and then like looked at the careers that I was interested in, it was relaxing in the sense that I was like, any single career that I choose is going to clear that is going to clear that wealth creation threshold. And so I think that people should really try and think about that because sometimes it's very easy to let compensation be the driving factor as you're deciding between roles and so forth. And the other thing that I'll say on that is like people early on in their career are so hyper focused on like compensation and what they're being paid. And when in the reality, at least for those going into business and many professions, what you make in the beginning part of your career is actually in the grand scheme of things, it's going to be it's going to be very non-meaningful relative to what you ultimately end up bringing when you hit the full stride of your career. So for me, I would rather kind of find a profession where I'm going to be excited and going to have the stamina and the energy to really become world class at whatever that thing is. And then if you become world class at anything, you're going to get paid a tremendous amount, as a result of that. And again, like compensation is not the driver, but it is something that I think it's worth thinking about. But I think the advice that I would give to people is just really define what your desired levels of compensation are and why, and actually think very practically about it. Like how much money do you feel like you need to bring in every single year? Do you plan on being in a single income household? Do you plan on being in a dual income household? That really changes the equation very heavily. Do you plan on sending your kids to private school? How much money do you need to have saved up by when? The more you just write some of this stuff down and think about it and ask people who are 10 years older than you and who have had to kind of live through these, that will allow you to like test your hypothesis, the greater clarity you'll have around how much money that you actually need. Once you have that clarity, it can inform the career decisions that you make. For example, in my case, that clarity really took a lot of weight off of my shoulders to say, okay, let me stop trying to prioritize everything based on compensation because I'm gonna clear the threshold that I've mapped out based on the conversations and the thought that I've put into it. So yeah, that's how I've thought about the trade-off, but I think it really starts with defining what these things mean for you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you, Triston, for putting this together and sharing your experiences. And yeah, I mean, as always, I think on LinkedIn, if you guys want to reach out, both Triston and myself are open to that.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. And if anybody has any questions that were unrelated to the topic today, I'll remain on. I'm just going to go and get a glass of water, but I'll remain on the line and happy to answer any unrelated questions as well. But otherwise, take care and hope everybody has a great rest of the day. And Khari, a huge thank you again for organizing this and moderating the conversation and so forth. I really appreciate it.